Hello, welcome to part two of our series supporting the Australian STEM Video Games Challenge. Thanks for joining me. I'm Craig Bentick. Today we'll be talking about the second phase of planning your game. We'll be looking at some strategies that can help you structure your team and plan out the project and actually give yourself the best chance at success. So to begin with, let's get real for a second.
Hello.
You have your idea of what you want to achieve. You know what it is that you want to build. You know how you're going to address the challenge. You've got all of that stuff that you worked on last time, and the team is all in agreement, hopefully, and everybody's kind of clear on what you want the end goal to be, the trajectory that you're setting. But how do you actually break that down and give yourselves the best chance of success? Well, you need to tear all of those features apart that you've identified in your product, the things that the player or the user is going to be able to do, and really get kind of granular with it. Break it down into the smallest pieces that you possibly can. You'll also need to identify things like dependencies. So a dependency is like, if you were building a structure like in engineering, you have to build a foundation first before you can build walls and a roof and all of that great stuff. Well, the same thing applies to any kind of software development and really any kind of project that you're embarking on, particularly in a group. Everybody needs to have a clear idea of what order things are going to need to be done in and why. So that sounds like a lot to sort of take on and think about from the outset, when what you really want to do is just get in there and start making stuff. Some of you may have already been doing things this week based upon the concept that you came up with. So how do we actually go about giving ourselves that best opportunity? Well, the first thing to look at is the time frame that you have. And I talked about this last time, but once you actually get into looking at those features and identifying the tasks that are required to build it, you'll need to estimate how long you think it will take to do something, and then kind of assess that compared to how long you actually have to complete it. You know, this is the point where you might go, yes, we're very confident with everything that we thought about last time, but when we actually break it down, we end up being 2 weeks over budget on our time frame. So how can we then take our idea and shape it and modify it to best meet that time frame? So having to kind of plan things out and put them down on paper and work out the estimates and all that kind of stuff, it's not exciting work. It's not the most enjoyable part of doing this stuff, but it gives you the opportunity to really have an honest conversation about how long it's going to take to do something without necessarily having any judgment in there. So we don't want a situation where somebody goes, oh, I'll do that, but it'll take me like a week, probably. I think it might take me a week because I have to learn this thing and that thing and I don't really know about that. So I think it'll take me at least a week. And then Joe Bloggs in the corner goes, well, it'll only take me 2 days because I'm a super smart brain guy and I'm like super awesome. That's not what we need. What we need is someone like Joe Bloggs in the corner saying, oh, I've done that stuff before. Let's have a chat about that and I can let you know the things that I found difficult and I'll share that knowledge with you so it might not take you as long. You can still keep that week estimate, but then with the help of somebody else on the team, just a little bit of help, a little bit of encouragement, a little bit of collaboration can make that thing happen a lot faster. So it kind of rolls into collaboration and cooperation as well. And it also helps you illustrate how realistic your expectations as a team are, because what generally will happen is that you'll have some people that think, that'll take a day. We don't, that's easy. I'll just knock that thing straight out. And that may be true for them, might not be true for the whole team, may not be true for them. They might be very overconfident. And so when you're doing these estimates, it's something that Scotty in Star Trek would do. None of you know who Scotty is. It's not Simon Pegg, it's Jimmy Doohan, where he says, always overestimate, always double the estimates that you think it's going to take to do something. He was the engineer, he had to keep the ship running. And he would say, always double those estimates, because when you do it in half the time, then you're a genius. Everybody thinks you're amazing and you're brilliant. That's half true. That's not something I suggest everybody do. You want to be realistic in your expectations, but everybody should be aware that you want to build a little bit of a buffer in there for things that might go wrong, and things that might crop up that delay stuff, or an aspect of that problem that people didn't really expect when you started out. So being realistic is important. Now, okay, here comes the cool stuff, right? we're going to talk about Agile. So Agile, Scrum in particular, like Agile itself is what we call a development philosophy. And it's, how do I describe this? It's a way of approaching software development in particular, where the priority is to always have a functional piece of software at the end of these small development cycles. The reason that that's good is because it allows a small group of people that have different sets of skills to work out how they want to tackle a particular challenge. So rather than having a team of 100 people all having to try and tackle this problem at once and sort of everybody's sort of going around with their, like chickens with their heads cut off, a small group of people who have complementary skill sets can more effectively come up with a solution and implement it and feel more ownership over it. So a lot of this Agile stuff also has to do with people feeling like they're valued and doing the best work that they can and kind of inspiring one another. So there's some namby-pamby stuff in there as well that I think, you know, is really useful to understand. But that comes more from having done a lot of software development and knowing and seeing how those things can go wrong and how people can get a bit demoralized. But this helps to address that. So its primary focus is enabling the team to consistently deliver a functional product at specified milestones during development. So there will be signposts in the road of time along your project where you say, at this point, we will have this thing and this will work like that. And everybody will be happy because you've delivered that. The entire product is not complete, but that feature set, that level of functionality has been completed. And, you know, it's not just about the technical stuff, it's also visual things and audio and sort of general design as well. So one of the other benefits of making sure that you have a working product at each of these kind of milestones, we'll call them for now, is that you can all look at what you've built and say, well, is it what we envisioned? Is it doing what we need it to do? If not, how do we as a group work out how to address that? Do we need to change our direction slightly? Do we need to prioritize certain tasks ahead of other ones? Do we need to get some help from outside to make this thing happen? And that's kind of where that's where the notion of agility comes in. It's about your ability to respond to change and be flexible and deal with things as they come in. Because whenever you're doing any kind of software development, things change all the time. The needs can change, new opportunities might arise, timeframes might change, all of that kind of stuff. So working in this method can help you be more adaptable to that change. Okay, so one of the core elements of the Agile methodology, we'll call it, is the user story. So this is kind of where you can start this breakdown process. So a user story is a really brief description of a feature or element of the product written from a user-oriented point of view. So that basically means we're speaking as the player, as the consumer of this thing that you're making. So here's an example. As a user, and you see I've got that in bold, I can press a key so that my character jumps. So you can see the format there for a user story, and there's lots of variations of this, but this is the one that I'm showing you here, is that as a blank, so as an individual, and that could be a team member, it could be the consumer, it could be anybody who's related to the project. There's another term we use called stakeholder, and that could be used to describe people that are working on the project or someone who's an investor or something like that. But that's all nerd stuff. You don't need to get into that now. As a whoever you are, I can blank. I can do something. There's an action word there or a term there. I can do something. I could take some kind of, there's some kind of functionality there so that something else happens, so that there is an outcome for me. All right. So I'll show you some more examples here. As a user, I can see my remaining turns displayed on screen. So, you know, like a puzzle game or a match 3 or something like that. I can see my remaining turns displayed on screen so that I can strategize how many moves I can use to win. That is a point in the game, that is a piece of functionality that needs to be in there. We need to be able to give that feedback to the player And we've also established why we need that. As a user, I can hear enemies moving in the game so that I have an awareness of the danger around me. I would have said situational awareness, but I thought that was a little bit too nerdy to throw in there. But that is the proposition. So when we write the user stories in this way, we're kind of describing a technical need or a user need, something that they require. So a functional thing that needs to happen, coupled with the justification and purpose that that feature serves as a part of the whole product. So that means we can reduce confusion about why a certain element or feature is important. So if I'm working on a team with you and you say, oh, we need to have this thing in there. And I go, but why? I don't understand why that needs to be there. What is that doing? I don't get how that fits into the whole product. And you could spend 25 minutes explaining it to me. I've been known to be a bit thick about these things, so it might take that long. But if you've got something like a user story that everybody has to kind of agree on, depending on how you do this agile stuff, there might be one or a couple of people that at a high level in your team will take care of writing these user stories. But you can also do it as a group. It can reduce that confusion, basically. It's that justification that everybody understands straight away. Oh, I get how the thing that I'm working on right now fits into the larger product, and I have a good idea of what that needs to do. And that can also give you a little bit of insight into how you might expand that user story in a way, or better execute the task that you need to do. The other thing that it lets you do is prioritize which of these stories are really, really important. So something like, as a user, I can share my score on Facebook would not be a high priority task if a high priority story if there was another story that was, as a user, I can start the game. Clearly that's a no-brainer. Starting the game would come first, but that's just kind of a glib example that I'm giving of how you can identify, well, that's far less important. You could even put like numerical or colored stickers on things that are sort of nice to have stories, as opposed to ones that are your what we call critical path. What are the absolute critical things that need to be there in order for this to be a product? Okay, hopefully that helps illustrate user stories a little bit. That would be the first thing I would do in your team, is go, okay, let's think about the user journey that we've talked about. Last time I was talking about having the artist do some storyboards and say, all right, this is what each screen looks like. Then the designer can kind of go, well, I need a button here to do that, and we'll need to have this over here. They need to be able to go back through that menu, or when they're in gameplay, they need to be able to do this. So can we have a storyboard that shows this kind of thing? Yes, this is a way that you can use that to identify those stories. So the storyboards and the stories can kind of inform one another, and you can adjust either of them to suit what your needs are as you continue to develop. All right, I almost lost my train of thought then, because I was looking at the chat, and I was like, my brain went, bleh. All right, so now that we're talking about Agile, we've got our user stories. What are the different stages that we can identify here? How do you actually go about using this system? All right, the first one is going to be backlog planning. So the backlog is going to be that big list of user stories. So what generally happens in a physical studio, we would use like index cards. They're sort of those little cards that have sort of, lines drawn on them. They might be yellow, they might be blue, they can have different color codes that you can use for different purposes. So user stories might be on blue ones, tasks might be on yellow ones, however you want to go about it. But just imagine a tiny little card that you're writing these user stories down on. All of these are stored in your backlog, and that priority that I was talking about, where you sort of go, all right, the first thing we need to do is have the player be able to start the game or see the main menu or whatever the case may be. That would be at the front of the backlog, all the way right down to the very back of it, where that's sort of the lowest priority task, the most unimportant one, but that you still want to try and achieve through development. So that's what the backlog is. It's just that list of cards kind of stored from highest priority to lowest. So when we actually plan this, we need to look at the project from a high level and break down those high-level user stories that the team needs to address. So, for example, here's another user story. As a user, I can press escape to pause the game so that I can take a break and return later without losing my progress. You might, write that story slightly differently, different terminology, but fundamentally, we've identified something that the user needs to be able to do in order for this to be a good experience for them. If they just had to quit the game and lose all their progress, they might not have a great time. So it might not be as high priority as stuff that's really critical to the gameplay, but it's still pretty important to the user experience. So you as a group need to identify where it's going to be appropriate to slot that in development. Where does that come in that priority order? So that task would then be added to the backlog along with all the other user stories, and then they all get prioritized depending on their importance to the overall user experience. So that's what I'm getting at with having a pause menu is great, but it's not the first thing you should start doing. Now, this is sort of the hot tip, the core tidbit. When you're doing this prioritization, work out what the core functionality of your game is really early on. What are the most important elements to the gameplay functionality? And indeed, maybe the visual style as well. If you can get the most basic version of your gameplay up on its feet first, then you can test it. You can work out if it's fun. Design can look at if there need to be puzzles designed for it, or if it needs to be tweaked. You can all see what it is at any given point, and it lets you have the most time to be agile, to adapt. Then you can look at things like, we'll put a main menu in, we'll put the pause menu in, we'll put that kind of stuff in. But that core experience needs to be there first, particularly because you guys are new to development. You can't really take things for granted. You can't just assume that this thing is going to be fun because you said it's going to be fun on paper, or address the challenge because it addresses it on paper. Maybe in practice it works slightly differently. So that agility is pretty important. Okay, so all right, we've got our backlog. We've got all of those stories prioritized. Now we need to move on to the sprint. So a sprint is a time frame, a short development period within the project. Generally speaking, between 2 and 4 weeks, depending on the time frame you have for the project. You might decide it should just be 1 week so that you can kind of compartmentalize things a bit more, but sometimes that's not enough time to get important things done. You really need to work that out for yourself. But between 2 and 4 weeks is generally a pretty good estimate. And in that time, the team will complete those user stories. And at the end of the sprint, drum roll, guess what? You're going to have a functional and updated version of that product that you could share with a stakeholder, you could deliver to a client, you can test yourself, and you as a team can assess and say, is this doing what we need it to do? So that sprint of between 2 to 4 weeks, you do it multiple times. There's a cycle to this whole development process. So we've established the backlog, and this sprint is really where that cycle begins. So each of these sprints allow the team to continuously be making progress, finding opportunities in the things that you're doing, and finding like victories in it and sharing those as a team, and finding new stuff to work on, keeping things kind of fresh, rather than have to look at everything from a high level and go, well, I don't know how we're even going to start to tackle this thing. This is insane. How are we actually going to do this? So the first thing you need to do in the sprint is plan it. So you'll sit down as a group and look at the backlog and look at the priority and say, okay, these are the 3 tasks, these are the 3 stories or 2 stories or 10 stories that our team thinks that we can address in this 2-week sprint. This one, and that one. So once you have chosen those stories, that's when the real meat happens, where the team has to break that down into tasks. So let's say as a user, I can input my name so that it will be seen with my high score. That story sounds like one feature, but it actually needs to be broken down into multiple tasks because the way it's written, it's addressing more than one technical requirement at any given time. Okay, so we have our story, we need to do this. Okay, we need to work out what needs to be coded for this. What art do we need for this? What audio do we need to this? Does design need to work out how this menu flow works? Or do they need to determine how the high scores get stored and how they're going to be shared or whatever the case may be? Those who are actually going to be working on it will help determine how long that's going to take and what those tasks may be. So, the example I have here, as a user, I can input my name so that it will be seen with my high score. So, the user being able to input their name and have it stored for later would be one task. And it may involve storing other information. So, alright, player input name. It might also store like their current high score, or it might store like their email address or some crazy thing like that. There might be all kinds of information that this represents a good opportunity to be storing at that time. So the task itself might be implement profile storage or implement save game or something like that. And that would be its own task. It would address something that's needed for this story, but it would also serve in the larger context of the project. So that's storing that information, but actually being able to display it and indeed having that score in the first place may be dependent on the core gameplay being there. So like I was saying earlier, you have to do things in the right order. There's no point having someone spend a day and a half working on a system to display the high score when there's no game to play. I know that sounds like a no-brainer, but it does bear consideration. So another team member may focus on how to calculate, store, and display the information in a separate part of the game than the point at which they input their name and create that save. Okay? I hope that makes sense. I feel like I've modeled that up a little bit. But fundamentally, you have two tasks, two team members, who then must collaborate and communicate to complete that user story for the sprint. So they have their own separate tasks. They might break this story down into 2 tasks each. And when they do, those are ones that they can work on independently and collaborate on and update the progress of what that task is doing at any given time. So there may also be an artist involved in that, so they would need to be rolled in as well. And they would have their own tasks. So 3 tasks for 3 team members from one story. So that might mean that the team for the sprint only says they're going to do 2 stories this sprint, whereas last time they might have done 4. But we look at the stories that we have here, and they're actually more complex than the ones that we did last time. So we've got our objective. I think of it almost like a quasi kind of military thing, where the general says, all right, you got to go take that hill. And then the soldiers, I know this is not how the military works. I know that I know that. But where the soldiers themselves would go, okay, boys, how are we going to do this thing, chaps? Let's go take that hill, or something of that nature. I don't know. It's that autonomy that the team has to determine how they're going to solve that problem that is very empowering about using Agile. So, next we have the sprint board. So this is where we kind of physically keep track of all of those tasks and what their status is at any given time. It's a visible record of the tasks and stories committed to by the team and the progress of each of them. So the board itself is broken into columns that indicate if a task is in progress, done, so completed, if it's blocked or on hold. So a blocked task is one where you're going, hey, I can't do this until Linda completes coding up the save game system, so I can't display the score or the name because it just doesn't exist yet. At which point Linda goes, oh yeah, okay, I've got that on my list for things to do once I've completed these tasks, so if you want to take something else on in the meantime, you can do that, or I can prioritize that. How do you want to do this thing? So it's not about like, they haven't done this thing. It's more like, I'm up to this stage with my thing, and it is dependent on something else being completed, So we'll need to maybe rejig things a little bit and just have a conversation and collaborate more closely, perhaps. So that's a blocked task, or one that's on hold would be one where you're kicking along and working on things, and then all of a sudden the requirements change. Let's say you're working for a client and they say, we wanted everything to be totally dynamic and internet web enabled and everything. And then they send an email going, we've had a change in management and now we don't want anything to be online or internet enabled, or we don't want any Googles in our thing. And so all of those tasks that you had set up to work on have just gone, and you're sitting there with a half-completed system in front of you, or half-completed artwork going, oh no, what do we do now? Well, it's a good thing that you're Agile, because you can just throw out those user stories, pick other ones, and reassess things at that point. Or at the very least, continue with what you were doing, but put the tasks that were related to that into on hold. So maybe those things will change back. Maybe they still need to go in there. But at the moment, we're just putting them on the back burner. So it provides an instantly understandable visual record of the team's progress within the sprint, and moving tasks into complete with the time remaining in the sprint. So I finished that 2 days early, can let you take on extra tasks or help other people that you might not have had time to, or take more things on from the backlog. That doesn't generally happen a huge amount of the time, because people generally make pretty good estimates, and things go wrong and blow timeframes out more than you might like. But, it's a possibility. So this is a very, very, very rough example of what a sprint board might look like. You could, this is just one example, you could have your user story in the first column here. So as a user, I can blah, 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 blah for all of those. And all of the tasks, you see the yellow cards, those are the tasks that you've broken down in your sprint planning meeting. So, Linda's going to work on the save system, Joe Bloggs is going to work on storing the names, and Timmy's going to work on, the main menu button artwork or whatever the case may be, in order to satisfy that story. Once you have got that at the start of the sprint, they're all in not started. You can move them to in progress when they get taken on, and then finally move them to done when they are done. This might seem like a redundant thing, because, well, what can't we just talk about it? Having a visual representation of this it is hugely beneficial, because it's tactile and you can actually pick it up and move that thing into the done column and feel like, yes, I did that thing. I won. Yes, we did it. There's a comment there that a Gantt chart would be useful here too. I totally agree, Marcus, but that's more of a project planning and sort of a management element. If you're needing to take the estimates that the team are giving you and work out what your projections are for the whole project, I 100% agree. But in terms of breaking the tasks down for the small team, this I feel is more useful day to day. That's useful for the project, but day to day, this would be more useful. So here's the question: what does done actually mean? And this is really important. This done column here, this is really important. So saying something is done or completed means that the task and its relevant elements have not just been put in there, they have been reviewed by the team and they've been tested. I cannot emphasize this strongly enough. It doesn't matter what role you are playing in a team, you have to take responsibility for your own work and for it to be in a working state. Whether you're a coder, an artist, a designer, audio person, particle effects, animator, I don't care. You have to take responsibility for your own work and ensuring that it is in there and working to the best of your ability before you put anything into that done column. Because if you do that and it's not complete, I mean, that just brings the whole team down. People are going to assume something's complete when it's not. And if it ends up being something really basic that you didn't test, you went, oh no, the textures are missing off this thing now because I just submitted it and I didn't check it. That's egg on your face, and people are not going to trust you as much moving forward. They're not going to respect you as much. So it's part of being professional. So that's the bit of noise that I'll make about that. Just taking a bit of responsibility there. So Here's another really cool element of sprint. So we've had a look at our sprint board. We've got our stories up there. We've got our tasks. But what we also have are daily stand-up meetings. So the stand-up is a short, fast meeting in which everybody shares at least 3 important pieces of information with the rest of the team. Sometimes you do this, you literally physically are standing up around this board that we're talking about with all the cards on it. And you will share with them. Some people have like a talking stick or a hacky sack that gets passed around to each person as it's their turn to speak. You will share with everybody. What did I achieve yesterday? What did I work on? And what went really well? What did I complete? What will I be doing today? What is the task that I'm undertaking? Am I continuing with the one that I have? What do I hope to achieve today? What is my intention? And then finally, what is blocking me? Is there something that's in my way? Is there a dependency that hasn't been done yet? Is there some piece of technology that's not working for me, or something else? Any task that kind of is being prevented from completion by something else would represent a blocking task. And so we looked at that in the board. So you'll also share that. If there's nothing blocking you, you don't have to share that. But it's really important to talk about, bam, I got this win yesterday. This thing worked. And today, bam, I'm going to nail this next thing. And it could be that you're just going, hey, I'm continuing with the thing I talked about yesterday. I'll pass it on to the next person. So this is also the point at which you can update the board if it's not already done. So you'll go throughout the day as you complete something and move it to done, or move something from not started to in progress, so that everybody goes, hey, oh, that thing's in progress now. That's awesome. You know, cool. It's good to see. And it's a way to kind of share thoughts about things that people are working on. If they're saying, hey, I guess I'm struggling through this thing because X, Y, Z. I'm Australian, Z. Then the rest of the team can go, well, hey, actually, I had a thought about that. Let's see if this helps, blah, 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 blah. And it's a good way to share. And it just kind of ensures that everybody still feels like a team. So I don't know what your setup is like. Hopefully you would be able to do this daily, or, you know, at least every other day. It's really important that you have this level of communication, even if it's something you do online or you do in person. It really makes a big difference. So once you have completed those tasks, you've gotten to the end of that fortnight. It's the end of the sprint. You will have a retrospective. So you'll get together and you'll look at what you ended up with. It's a chance to review the state of the project, and also look at the processes and the way that you worked. What worked well, what didn't work well, what could be improved, and sort of look at what kind of wins you've taken from this sprint that can go into the next one. You know, did you get an extra task finished? Has it illustrated some awesome win, you know, that you didn't expect coming through? So it can help you with your view for the future, but also just that level of, all right, what are we doing that's working? Is there something, are we not having our stand-up meetings at the right time of day? Or are we not using the right terminology here? Or, you know, are we trying to do too much? Is another question that you can kind of ask yourself. And that testing can also illustrate, like, is the project actually going to work? Is it going to do what you need? So that kind of honest review is a really important thing. So once you're done with that sprint retrospective, you will cycle all the way back around to sprint planning, where you will take on new user stories and plan the next 2 to 4 weeks of work. Work out what the tasks associated with those user stories are. So you take that user story, you crack it open like a Kinder Surprise, and you get like 5 toys out of it. But those toys are jobs that you have to do. So maybe my metaphor is a little bit strained, but I think you take the point. And you can see how it is a loop. Each time you come through, you look at your backlog, take the stories out of it, break those into tasks, put them on the board, have your daily stand-up meeting, move them into in progress, and then into done, and then bam, you have your delivery of your sprint and your retrospective, and then you do the whole thing again until the product is finished. So, I'm sure I've missed something tremendously important there, but I thought I'd take a second to talk about some of the tools that you could use, most of which you may already know about, but some you may not. So there are some very basic, useful production tools. The first one I wanted to look at is Trello. So it's a task management and communication tool that is effectively like an online version of that sprint board. So it's free, you can use it in a browser, and you can set up the cards that we're talking about. So you would have cards for stories and cards for tasks, and you would be able to categorize them by what department was working on them. You can assign them to people, and you can also do things like attach files to them, make comments, send messages, and just generally have a lot of visibility and back and forth between developers. We use this quite a lot when working in teams online. There are a number of other tools that are similar to this and ones that extend on it in different ways, but it's a very effective way to keep that high-level view nice and clean and have a centralized location to look at things from. I'll give you a quick look at an example here. So this is a Trello that I've set up as a template, and I'll see about sharing this with everyone so that you can have a crack at this if you want to. But I've tried to set up kind of a rough example of what each kind of column of this thing might be. So this would be where you would store tasks from the current project. So these are kind of individual cards, and they have sub-cards in them. So you can move them around and reorder them if you want to, all of that great stuff. But this would be where you put the user stories for the current sprint. And you could add a card and go, create game manager for menu, blah, 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 whatever. Make a nice hat would be one of my tasks. That's not useful, Craig. You're not doing anyone any favors. But once you've created that, we can determine where it's at. We can edit a description for it. The player needs a new hat as their current hat is worn and ugly. All right. Boom. High level description of what the task needs to be. You would do much, much, much better descriptions than that. But then I can start adding comments. I want to make a red hat. And I send that, and that's now stored down here as part of a historical conversation about this task. I can also do things like attach files or reference other things. I can even add smileys. So we can also do things like add other people from the team onto this card if they need to work on it. Like, you and your teachers can have a look at Trello and see if it's going to be useful for what you need, but that's effectively how we can work with a card. Now, I've made my nice hat task, right? I'm going to move this into in progress. I'm working on it. And I'll go, I want to make a red hat. And my update would be, I can't find red on my computer. So the hat is now brown. Now, let's do that, right? I've just updated that. That's an update on my task. Somebody else might come in and go, but like the last hat was brown, we specifically didn't want a brown hat, blah, 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 blah. We can attach files. We can also, here's a really cool thing. We can add a checklist. So let's call this subtasks. And I can say model the hat. That's one task. Create a UV unwrap for the hat. That's another task. And I can also then say generate a cloth texture for the hat. Let's say that. And now I can tick that and it will list this task as being 33% complete. So you can see how some of the methodology from the Agile Scrum stuff and that progress thing is coming through in here. So if you were to have a story and then list the tasks like this would be a really good way for you as a team to sort of see what that progress is like. And I'm positive, in fact, I know for a fact that you can have Trello integrate with other tools, like there's a Gantt chart tool. Somebody was mentioning Gantt charts earlier, where it can take these time frames, so we can add a due date to this and say it's due on the 25th, and now it has a date on it. It can take all of this information and correlate, generate a chart for you so you can get a high level view of the project. But we're really getting in the weeds with this stuff at the moment. The cool thing is I've made my hat, so it's blocked now because I don't have any red, but then that problem is overcome and I can take it out of the blocked column, drop that into done because my hat is done. So, so the project story backlog is where we would store all of the user stories. I also tend to have a section here for resources, documents, and links and things like that. So if you have a design document, storyboards, concept art, mood boards, that kind of a thing, obviously they want to be associated with the tasks that people are working on, but at the same time, you can also just list them in here for people to look at. Stuff like a design document is really important for you to have listed here, because 9 times out of 10, and I'm just going to say this outright, 9 times out of 10, team members aren't going to sit there and read through the whole design document when working out how they need to address a particular task. So they need to have really quick access to it, and maybe if you're the designer and you're working on that document, you need to break it out into smaller chunks perhaps, so that certain elements of the game are more easily accessible, I suppose, sections of the design document. So even if that's putting hyperlinks to your Google Doc in this thing, saying this is to do with the core gameplay, this is the menu system, blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff. Then we would have a section for critical dates. So when your sprints begin and end, when you're going to be having meetings, when the project is meant to be delivered, all of that good stuff. And the other thing that I tend to keep as well are notes from meetings. And this sounds really laborious and not massively creative, but having an agenda when you go into a meeting, not necessarily like an agenda like, I have an agenda, but just going, these are the 3 things we need to achieve. And that's part of the reason why daily stand-ups are really effective, because you're asking 2 to 3 really critical questions. What have you done? What are you going to do? What's stopping you from doing what you need to do? And the implicit question out of that, what is blocking you, is how can we as a team help overcome that block that's there? So that's an example of Trello, if you haven't seen it already, and how I might go about using it. That's just one man's opinion. Could be wrong. And then obviously we've got Google Drive, which is ace. It's a really good way for you to store those files online. You can collaborate on things. You can share them. Everything is great. It's free with your Google account. And they can be managed by schools as well. If the students have accounts like that, that can be a useful thing. And even a method for delivering your final build. So that can be a handy thing. I mean, it's just one of like 100 different cloud services. So that's really what I'm saying is file storage. And the final thing to contemplate, and I don't think this is necessarily going to be hugely relevant at a student level, but it's really, really worth knowing that it exists and knowing that it is a standard thing in software development, is version control. 2 of the most popular tools out there are Git and Perforce. Version control systems are used to store files on a server much the same way as cloud storage. The difference is that a version control system will keep all of the previous revisions of a file, so that if something goes wrong, if something gets broken, you can roll those files back. It can prevent more than one person working on a given file at any time, so that you don't have conflicts in which people clobber one another's work. So somebody goes, hey, I put the model in, and then someone else goes, blonk, I've checked the model in and it's the old version and everything's broken now. But I didn't know because it worked on my end. That's why version control is really important, as well as things like your ability to branch a project at a given time. So very, very briefly, branching a project would be if you are working on an overall, let's say a game, and you're working on it for a year, and every 3 months you have to deliver a milestone build to the publisher, who is the person who's giving you the money to make it. Right before you have to deliver that milestone, or shortly beforehand, you would branch all of the files. You'd essentially create a second copy of the project in parallel with the one that everybody's working on, that's kind of in quarantine. It's protected from any risky things that happen in that main branch. We kind of talk about it in terms of branches. And so that second cloned version that is quarantined can be tightened up and bug tested really hard. And, if there are hacks that need to go in to make that thing work that won't be acceptable for the final product, but are kind of okay for this milestone, that's where you can do those things. They're safely ensconced in that branch. And then once that branch is like done and delivered and tested, if there are things in that are really effective, good work's happened, that can be merged back into the main branch if you want to. So it's a way of kind of breaking off and doing risky things outside of the main project that everybody needs to be working on. Because as soon as the main branch of a project gets broken, then everybody stops working and you lose all that productivity and everything just sucks. So, as I say here, I really do hope that this has been interesting, useful, and helps you on your way to planning your project. I'm absolutely open to any questions that people have. I will kick around for as long as people want me to, which probably means about 10 minutes, to just kind of shoot the breeze. So what do people want to know? There is latency in the stream, so I'll be sitting here for about a minute very quietly, just waiting for the questions. Just start typing. Just do that thing. Question time. Oh, the latency is real. Just to sort of, what are the other videos going to be on? Is there a good way for a solo dev to come up with ideas? All right. How to come up with... okay. All right. I can answer all of these questions. Is a good way for a solo dev to come up with ideas. Start really, really, really simple. One way I sort of think about it is like, in terms of you can start with a core gameplay mechanic. And if you think about it like an arcade, where you have to, like basketball, you have to throw the ball in the hoop. That's the simplest thing. Or, a golf game where golf game's kind of complex. It's really about going, what is the absolute simplest mechanical thing that I can make happen, and how do I graft this around, a theme? How can I make this address the theme? For a solo dev, it's very difficult to really get yourself across that finish line. You have to be very dedicated, very motivated. Look at games that you like, or look at games that are somewhat similar, and try and pull those apart. I mean, there's really nothing wrong with borrowing from the greats in a way, particularly when you are starting out. Like, you might be putting this pressure on yourself to do something really massively genius that nobody's ever seen before. The fact is, there's a quote that's like, all the best ideas have already been had, essentially. So don't be afraid to look at something that already works. Maybe strip away the art and that kind of a thing, and try and look at what it's doing at a functional level. What is it mechanically doing, and how could you graft your idea onto that? Do you know how long it takes to make a beta game? So the term beta is a stage of development. So when we break down the time frame that we have, we would have pre-production, which would be a period at the start, which is kind of what you guys are doing right now, where you're thinking about the idea, working out how practical it is, breaking the tasks down, working out whether you can do it in the time frame that you've given yourselves. Then you would move into production itself. So pre-production would be when you do your R&D, your research and development. So like, okay, can we make things do stuff with physics? Or do we want this to be 3D or 2D? It's sort of that testing phase where you can be creative and learn about what the team is good at. And then production is where you actually go, okay, we know what our direction is. Bam, now we start executing on it. And that's when you can be doing your sprints. And you're doing those 2 to 4 week cycles. Once you reach a certain point in development, and you need to determine when that is, toward the end, your project will have, you will enter alpha, where you are effectively feature complete. You have all of the content in there that you intend to have. So all of the missions are there, all the sound is there, all the functionality is there, all the levels are complete, all of that kind of stuff. They won't be perfect. There will still be bugs in your software. There will still be visual issues with it that need to be fixed. But fundamentally, everything that you set out to achieve should be there in that alpha. Then you test that alpha. You find the lowest hanging fruit. You address the things that need to be taken care of first, that have the biggest impact. And then when you feel like that is pretty stable and you've done that, you will move into beta, which is where you start your really comprehensive testing, where you get, well, and you can do this beforehand, but realistically, this is the point at which you would get people from outside to come in and start playing the game or testing it out for you, doing focus testing, which is where you just get kind of random people from off the street to come in and tell you what they think of it and see how they play it and, you know, observe what they do to identify what you might need to fix or change in your product or if it's working really well. And then once you've completed your beta, you would have your master, your gold master release phase, where you would actually send the final build of the project off to whoever was pressing it onto discs and sending it out to stores or putting it up on an online store. Okay, well, look, I think this is probably a pretty good point for me to wrap things up. Thank you very much for the questions and for attending, and I very much look forward to seeing what the results are, because I think you are all going to do great, and I really can't wait to see what the other parts of this series look like. This is it from me, Craig Bentic. Thank you very much for being here with me. Best of luck, and take care.